Sarah Martinez had always been the kind of person who preferred listening to speaking. At 32, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that some mistook for weakness. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her clothes were practical rather than fashionable. She had worked as a court clerk for 8 years at the downtown courthouse, a job that most people overlooked entirely. Every morning, Sarah arrived at the courthouse 45 minutes before her shift began. She used this time to organize case files, check schedules, and prepare the courtroom for the day ahead. The attorneys barely acknowledged her presence, treating her like another piece of furniture in the mahogany-paneled room. They would stride past her desk in their expensive suits, discussing their cases in loud voices, never imagining that the quiet woman organizing papers was absorbing every word. The courthouse buzzed with activity most days. Lawyers hurried through the halls, their briefcases swinging as they rushed between courtrooms. Defendants sat nervously on wooden benches, whispering to family members about their fears. Court reporters typed away silently, capturing every spoken word for the record. In the middle of all this chaos, Sarah moved like a shadow, efficient and nearly invisible. Judge Harrison presided over Courtroom 3A, where Sarah worked. He was a stern man in his 60s, with gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through people. He had a reputation for running a tight courtroom and showing little patience for unprepared attorneys. Despite his intimidating presence, he had always been fair to Sarah, though their interactions were limited to brief exchanges about scheduling and paperwork. The other court staff included Margaret, an older woman who handled administrative duties and never missed an opportunity to gossip about the cases they processed. There was also Robert, a bailiff who took his job seriously but often joked with Sarah during breaks. These colleagues knew Sarah as reliable and hardworking, but they never suspected the depth of her understanding of the legal proceedings she witnessed daily. Sarah's interest in law had begun years earlier, when she was going through her own difficult divorce. Unable to afford proper legal representation, she had spent countless hours in the law library, teaching herself about family law, property rights, and court procedures. What started as necessity had grown into genuine fascination. She began reading legal journals in her spare time, following landmark cases, and studying the strategies used by successful attorneys. Her personal experience with the legal system had been frustrating. Her ex-husband's lawyer had been aggressive and well-connected, while her court-appointed attorney seemed overwhelmed and underprepared. Sarah had watched helplessly as legal technicalities and procedural errors cost her significant assets and limited her time with her young daughter Emma. This experience had taught her that knowing the law was not enough. Understanding how to navigate the system was equally important. During her years as a court clerk, Sarah had observed hundreds of cases. She noticed patterns in how different attorneys approached their arguments, which tactics were effective with particular judges, and where cases were won or lost. She saw brilliant lawyers stumble over simple procedural issues and watched mediocre attorneys win cases through careful preparation and attention to detail. The attorneys in the courthouse fell into predictable categories. There were the flashy ones who relied on dramatic presentations, but often lacked substance in their legal research. There were the old-school lawyers who knew every judge personally, but sometimes seemed out of touch with current legal trends. Then there were the young associates from big firms, armed with extensive resources, but lacking practical courtroom experience. Sarah paid special attention to the attorneys who consistently achieved good results for their clients. She noticed that the most successful lawyers were not necessarily the loudest or most dramatic. Instead, they were the ones who came to court thoroughly prepared, who understood the judge's preferences, and who could adapt their strategy based on how the proceedings were unfolding. One attorney who particularly impressed Sarah was David Chun, a solo practitioner who handled mostly criminal defense cases. He was not the most eloquent speaker, and he certainly was not the best-dressed lawyer in the courthouse. However, he won cases that other attorneys might have considered hopeless. Sarah observed that David's success came from his meticulous preparation and his ability to find overlooked details that could change the outcome of a case. Another lawyer Sarah admired was Patricia Williams, who specialized in family law. Patricia had a gentle demeanor that put clients at ease, but she was fierce in the courtroom when fighting for her clients' interests. Sarah noticed that Patricia always took time to explain legal procedures to her clients, ensuring they understood what was happening at each stage of their case. As Sarah continued her daily work, she began to see patterns in the types of mistakes that led to unfavorable outcomes. She observed cases where clients suffered because their attorneys had missed filing deadlines, failed to object to improper evidence, or had not adequately prepared witnesses for testimony. These observations reinforced her belief that careful attention to detail was often more important than courtroom theatrics. The courthouse was also a place where Sarah witnessed the human side of legal proceedings. She saw families torn apart by bitter custody disputes, small business owners facing bankruptcy, and individuals struggling with criminal charges that could change their lives forever. These experiences reminded her that behind every case file was a real person whose future hung in the balance. Sarah's own life outside the courthouse was relatively quiet. She lived in a small apartment with her daughter Emma, who was now 12 years old. Their relationship had grown stronger over the years, partly because Sarah's legal troubles had taught her to value their time together. Emma was a bright girl who often helped her mother review legal documents, not understanding their significance, but enjoying the feeling of being trusted with important papers. During evenings and weekends, Sarah continued her legal education. She had enrolled in online courses about constitutional law, civil procedure, and legal writing. She also attended free legal seminars offered by the local bar association, where she learned about recent changes in legislation and court procedures. These activities went unnoticed by her colleagues, who assumed she spent her free time watching television or running errands. Sarah's apartment was filled with legal textbooks, case law summaries, and highlighted copies of court decisions. Her small dining table often served as a desk where she spread out materials for her studies. Emma had grown accustomed to seeing her mother surrounded by legal documents and had learned to be quiet when Sarah was concentrating on particularly challenging concepts. The financial pressures in Sarah's life were constant, but manageable. Her salary as a court clerk was modest, and she had to budget carefully to cover rent, groceries, and Emma's school expenses. She had no money for expensive clothes or entertainment, but she was determined to continue her legal education despite the cost. Sometimes she would skip lunch to save money for a new legal textbook or course materials. Sarah's family had initially been puzzled by her intense interest in legal matters. Her parents, who ran a small grocery store, could not understand why she spent so much time reading about court cases instead of focusing on finding a better-paying job. Her sister regularly suggested that Sarah should consider getting remarried to improve her financial situation, advice that Sarah politely ignored. Despite the challenges in her personal life, Sarah found genuine satisfaction in her work at the courthouse. She enjoyed the intellectual challenge of understanding complex legal issues and took pride in maintaining accurate records and efficient procedures. Her supervisors consistently rated her performance as excellent, though none of them realized the extent of her legal knowledge. The attorneys who worked regularly in Judge Harrison's courtroom had become familiar faces to Sarah, but most of them treated her as part of the background. They would ask her to locate files or schedule appointments, but they never engaged her in conversations about legal strategy or case law. This suited Sarah perfectly, as it allowed her to observe and learn without drawing attention to herself. As the months passed, Sarah began to notice changes in the types of cases being heard in their courtroom. There seemed to be an increase in complex civil litigation involving small businesses and individual plaintiffs who could not afford experienced attorneys. She watched as these cases were often handled by young lawyers who lacked the experience to navigate the complicated procedural requirements effectively. One particular case caught Sarah's attention because it reminded her of her own legal struggles. A single mother named Maria was fighting to keep her small restaurant after her business partner had allegedly embezzled funds and left her responsible for debts she had not incurred. Maria's attorney was clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of the case and seemed to be making fundamental errors in his legal approach. Sarah found herself silently critiquing the attorney's strategy and identifying missed opportunities that could have strengthened Maria's position. She noticed that important evidence was not being presented effectively and that certain legal precedents that could have supported Maria's case were never mentioned. It frustrated Sarah to watch someone struggle with legal problems that she believed could be solved with better preparation and strategy. During court breaks, Sarah sometimes overheard conversations between attorneys about their cases. She learned about the financial pressures facing solo practitioners and small law firms, many of whom were taking on cases they were not fully qualified to handle because they needed the income. She also heard complaints about clients who could not afford proper legal representation, but whose cases were too complex for limited resource solutions. These conversations made Sarah think about the gap between those who could afford excellent legal representation and those who could not. She had experienced this inequality herself and continued to see it play out in the courtroom every day. Wealthy defendants had teams of experienced attorneys, while working-class plaintiffs often had to represent themselves or rely on overworked public defenders. Sarah's observations of the legal system were not limited to courtroom proceedings. She also paid attention to the informal networks that seemed to influence case outcomes. She noticed which attorneys played golf together, which ones had clerked for particular judges, and which law firms had political connections that opened doors for their clients. Understanding these relationships helped her better comprehend why some cases succeeded while others failed. The more Sarah learned about the law, the more confident she became in her ability to spot legal errors and missed opportunities. She began to mentally prepare stronger arguments for the cases she observed, identifying witnesses who should be called, evidence that should be presented, and legal theories that could change outcomes. These mental exercises became a daily habit that sharpened her analytical skills and deepened her understanding of legal strategy. As her knowledge grew, Sarah also became more aware of the ethical issues that permeated the legal profession. She observed attorneys who seemed more concerned with billing hours than achieving results for their clients. She saw lawyers who accepted cases outside their areas of expertise without adequately preparing themselves to provide competent representation. She witnessed court officers who showed favoritism towards certain attorneys while treating others with obvious disdain. Despite these frustrations, Sarah continued to believe in the potential of the legal system to provide justice when properly utilized. She saw examples of attorneys who worked tirelessly for their clients, judges who carefully considered all evidence before making decisions, and court staff who went beyond their basic duties to ensure fair proceedings. These positive examples motivated her to continue learning and improving her own understanding of legal principles. Sarah's daily routine at the courthouse had become second nature to her. She knew which attorneys preferred their files organized in particular ways, which judges were likely to call cases early or late, and which court reporters needed extra time to prepare transcripts. This attention to detail made her valuable to the smooth operation of the courtroom, even though her contributions often went unrecognized. The end of each workday brought Sarah a sense of accomplishment, not just from completing her assigned tasks, but from the informal legal education she received by observing court proceedings. She would return home to Emma with new insights about legal strategy and fresh examples of how theoretical legal principles played out in real cases. These daily lessons were gradually building towards something larger, though Sarah had not yet fully recognized what that might be. As winter approached, Sarah noticed increased tension among the court staff due to budget pressures and staffing shortages. There was talk of potential layoffs and reduced hours, which created anxiety for everyone who depended on courthouse employment for their livelihood. Sarah worried about her job security, but also recognized that any disruption to her current position might force her to consider alternative career paths that could make better use of her growing legal expertise. The morning that would change everything started like any other Tuesday. Sarah arrived at her usual time, unlocking the courthouse entrance and making her way to courtroom 3A. The February air was still crisp, and frost covered the windows of the old building. She had just finished organizing the morning's case files when she heard urgent voices echoing through the corridor. Judge Harrison was scheduled to hear a complex civil case involving Thompson Manufacturing, a local company accused of environmental violations that had allegedly caused health problems in a nearby neighborhood. The case had been in preparation for months, with dozens of residents as plaintiffs and millions of dollars in potential damages at stake. The lead attorney for the plaintiffs, Michael Rodriguez, had built his entire practice around this single case. Sarah watched from her desk as court personnel rushed back and forth with worried expressions. Margaret approached her with unprecedented urgency, explaining that Rodriguez had been hospitalized during the night with a severe heart attack. His condition was serious, and there was no possibility he would be able to appear in court. The trial was scheduled to begin in 2 hours, with a jury already selected and witnesses prepared to testify. The situation became more complicated as the morning progressed. Rodriguez's small law firm had no other attorneys qualified to handle such a complex case. His paralegal, Janet Morrison, arrived at the courthouse in tears, explaining that Rodriguez had been working 18-hour days for months and had ignored warning signs about his health. The case files were voluminous and highly technical, involving environmental science, medical evidence, and intricate legal theories that required specialized knowledge. Judge Harrison called an emergency meeting in his chambers with representatives from both sides. Sarah could hear raised voices through the closed door as attorneys for Thompson Manufacturing argued that the case should be dismissed or indefinitely postponed. They claimed that replacing counsel at such a late stage would be unfair to their client, who had spent significant resources preparing for trial under the assumption that they would be facing Rodriguez's specific legal strategy. The plaintiff's situation was desperate. Many of the residents had waited years for their day in court, and some were seriously ill from their alleged exposure to industrial chemicals. They had invested their life savings in legal fees and medical expenses, and further delays could be devastating. Several of the older plaintiffs might not survive long enough to see justice if the case were postponed for months or years while they searched for new representation. Janet Morrison approached Sarah's desk during a brief recess, carrying several boxes of case materials. She looked overwhelmed and exhausted, clearly unsure how to proceed. As she set down the boxes, she mentioned that Rodriguez had always praised Sarah's organizational skills and attention to detail. He had apparently noticed Sarah's efficiency during previous cases and had commented to Janet that Sarah seemed to understand legal procedures better than many attorneys. Out of genuine concern, Sarah offered to help Janet organize the case materials and locate specific documents that might be needed for the emergency hearing. As she began reviewing the files, Sarah quickly realized that the case was even more complex than she had imagined. There were environmental impact studies, medical records from dozens of plaintiffs, expert witness reports, and corporate documents spanning several years. However, as Sarah continued reading, she began to see patterns and connections that painted a clear picture of Thompson Manufacturing's alleged wrongdoing. The company had apparently known about potential health risks from their chemical processing operations, but had continued using dangerous procedures to save money. Internal memos showed executives discussing ways to minimize their legal exposure while avoiding costly safety improvements. What struck Sarah most was that the case file contained several legal arguments and evidence presentations that seemed incomplete or poorly organized. She could see opportunities to strengthen the plaintiff's position by connecting certain pieces of evidence more effectively and by citing relevant case law that Rodriguez had apparently overlooked. Her years of observing courtroom strategy and studying legal precedents had given her insights that could potentially make a significant difference. Judge Harrison reconvened the hearing and announced that he was inclined to grant a continuance despite the hardship it would cause the plaintiffs. He explained that ensuring adequate representation was essential for maintaining the integrity of the legal process. The Thompson manufacturing attorneys looked relieved, while several plaintiffs in the gallery began to cry quietly. At that moment, something inside Sarah clicked into place. She thought about her own experience fighting for justice without proper representation. She remembered watching countless cases where people suffered because they could not afford experienced attorneys. She considered all the legal knowledge she had accumulated over the years and realized that this might be her opportunity to put that knowledge to use in a meaningful way. Sarah stood up from her clerk's desk, action that surprised everyone in the courtroom. In a clear, steady voice, she addressed Judge Harrison directly, something that court clerks simply did not do during proceedings. She explained that she had been reviewing the case materials and believed that she could provide adequate representation for the plaintiffs if the court would permit it. The silence that followed was profound. Judge Harrison stared at Sarah with astonishment, while the Thompson manufacturing attorneys looked at each other in disbelief. Some observers in the gallery began whispering among themselves, wondering if they had heard correctly. Janet Morrison's mouth fell open as she tried to process what was happening. Judge Harrison asked Sarah to approach the bench, where he questioned her about her legal qualifications in a low voice. Sarah explained that while she had never practiced law formally, she had been studying legal principles for 8 years and had observed thousands of hours of court proceedings. She described her extensive self-education and her deep familiarity with the specific legal issues involved in the Thompson manufacturing case. The judge's expression remained skeptical, but he seemed intrigued by Sarah's confidence and apparent knowledge of the case details. He pointed out that representing clients in such a complex matter required admission to the state bar, and that allowing an unqualified person to practice law would be highly irregular. Sarah acknowledged these concerns, but argued that the plaintiffs' right to their day in court should not be sacrificed due to technicalities when competent representation was available. The Thompson manufacturing lead counsel, Richard Sterling, immediately objected to any irregular arrangement. He argued that allowing a court clerk to represent plaintiffs would make a mockery of the legal profession and could provide ground for appeal regardless of the trial outcome. He suggested that the proper course was postponement until qualified counsel could be retained, even if that took several months. Judge Harrison called for a longer recess to research the legal precedents for such an unusual situation. During this break, Sarah found herself surrounded by the plaintiffs and their family members who desperately wanted to know if she could really help them. An elderly man named Frank Patterson, whose wife had developed respiratory problems allegedly from chemical exposure, grasped Sarah's hand and told her that she was their last hope for justice. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but Sarah felt more prepared for this challenge than she had ever felt about anything in her life. She spent the recess period quickly reviewing the most critical case files and making notes about key arguments and evidence. Her years of mental preparation seemed to culminate in this moment, when all her accumulated knowledge could finally serve a meaningful purpose. Janet Morrison became Sarah's unofficial assistant during this chaotic period, helping to locate specific documents and explaining Rodriguez's original strategy for presenting evidence. She expressed amazement at Sarah's understanding of the case details and her ability to quickly identify important information that even she had overlooked. Janet began to believe that Sarah might actually be capable of representing the plaintiffs effectively. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison announced his decision. While highly irregular, he would allow Sarah to represent the plaintiffs under special circumstances, given the emergency nature of the situation and the potential harm to the plaintiffs from further delays. However, he established strict conditions. Sarah would be allowed to present evidence and examine witnesses, but any significant legal motions would need to be reviewed by an experienced attorney acting as consulting counsel. The courtroom erupted with excitement from the plaintiff's section and outrage from the defense table. Richard Sterling immediately moved for a mistrial, arguing that the proceedings had become irregular beyond repair. Judge Harrison denied the motion, but warned that he would be monitoring Sarah's performance closely and would intervene if he believed the plaintiffs were not receiving competent representation. Sarah's first task was to present an opening statement to the jury. She had observed hundreds of opening statements during her years as a court clerk, and she understood that this moment would set the tone for the entire trial. She needed to capture the jury's attention while clearly explaining the complex technical evidence they would be hearing over the coming days. Standing before the jury for the first time, Sarah felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. She began by introducing herself honestly as someone who had spent years learning about the law while working in the courthouse. She explained that her unconventional background might actually help her communicate complex legal concepts in everyday language that everyone could understand. Sarah's opening statement focused on the human impact of Thompson Manufacturing's alleged actions. She described families who had lived in the neighborhood for generations, trusting that local businesses would operate responsibly. She explained how chemical contamination had allegedly affected children's development, caused respiratory problems in elderly residents, and created cancer clusters that had devastated the community. Rather than getting lost in technical details, Sarah organized her presentation around the stories of individual plaintiffs. She introduced Frank Patterson and his wife Mary, describing how their quiet retirement had been disrupted by unexplained health problems that doctors eventually linked to chemical exposure. She talked about young families who had chosen the neighborhood for its safety and affordability, only to discover that their children were being exposed to dangerous toxins. The jury listened intently as Sarah outlined the evidence they would see during the trial. She explained that internal company documents would show that Thompson Manufacturing executives knew about health risks but chose to prioritize profits over public safety. She described expert witnesses who would testify about the connection between the company's operations and the health problems experienced by neighborhood residents. Sarah's presentation was methodical and well-organized, drawing on her years of observing effective courtroom strategies. She avoided legal jargon and focused on clear, logical explanations that helped the jury understand the significance of evidence they would be evaluating. Her genuine concern for the plaintiffs was evident, and several jury members seemed moved by her descriptions of how ordinary families had been affected. The defense opening statement, presented by Richard Sterling, attempted to portray Sarah as unqualified and the entire proceeding as irregular. Sterling argued that the plaintiffs had not proven any causal connection between Thompson Manufacturing's operations and alleged health problems. He suggested that the residents' health issues could be explained by numerous other factors, including age, lifestyle choices, and exposure to environmental hazards from other sources. Sterling's strategy was clearly designed to undermine Sarah's credibility while creating doubt about the scientific evidence linking chemical exposure to health problems. He emphasized the complexity of environmental health issues and suggested that the plaintiff's case relied on speculation rather than proven facts. His presentation was polished and professional, reflecting years of experience in high-stakes litigation. However, Sarah noticed that Sterling's opening statement relied heavily on technical arguments that might confuse jurors rather than addressing the emotional impact of the evidence. She began to formulate her strategy for presenting the plaintiff's case in a way that would make complex scientific evidence accessible and compelling to ordinary people. The first witness Sarah called was Dr. Elizabeth Chun, an environmental health specialist who had studied the Thompson Manufacturing facility and its impact on the surrounding community. Dr. Chun had extensive credentials and had published research on industrial pollution and public health. Sarah had spent hours reviewing Dr. Chun's report and preparing questions that would help the jury understand her findings. Sarah's examination of Dr. Chun was careful and thorough, building a foundation for understanding how chemical contamination occurs and how it can affect human health. She asked Dr. Chun to explain her methodology for studying the Thompson manufacturing site and to describe the specific chemicals that had been detected in soil and water samples from the neighborhood. Dr. Chun testified that her investigation had found elevated levels of several toxic chemicals in areas surrounding the Thompson manufacturing facility. She explained that these chemicals were consistent with byproducts from the company's manufacturing processes and that the pattern of contamination suggested that the source was Thompson's operations rather than other potential sources in the area. The cross-examination of Dr. Chun by the defense was aggressive and technical, designed to challenge her methodology and conclusions. Sterling questioned her credentials, suggested alternative explanations for the contamination, and attempted to create doubt about the reliability of her testing procedures. However, Sarah had prepared Dr. Chun well, and she was able to defend her findings convincingly. During redirect examination, Sarah helped Dr. Chun clarify points that the defense had tried to confuse. She asked simple, direct questions that allowed Dr. Chun to restate her key findings in language that the jury could easily understand. Sarah's approach demonstrated her growing confidence in courtroom procedures and her ability to adapt her strategy based on the defense's tactics. The second day of testimony focused on medical evidence linking chemical exposure to the health problems experienced by plaintiffs. Sarah called Dr. Michael Torres, a physician who had treated several residents of the affected neighborhood. Dr. Torres testified about unusual patterns of illness he had observed, including respiratory problems, skin conditions, and neurological symptoms that were consistent with exposure to industrial chemicals. Sarah's questioning of Dr. Torres was designed to help the jury understand how medical professionals diagnose environmentally related illnesses. She asked him to explain how he had ruled out other potential causes for his patients' symptoms and why he believed their problems were related to chemical exposure. Dr. Torres described specific cases where patients had improved after moving away from the contaminated area, providing compelling evidence of a connection between location and health problems. The defense cross-examination attempted to suggest that the plaintiff's health problems could be explained by normal aging processes, genetic predisposition, or lifestyle factors unrelated to environmental contamination. Sterling questioned whether Dr. Torres had adequate expertise in environmental medicine and suggested that his conclusions were based on speculation rather than scientific certainty. However, Sarah's redirect examination allowed Dr. Torres to explain why environmental factors were the most likely explanation for the pattern of illnesses he had observed. She asked him to describe the improvement in symptoms that several patients had experienced after reducing their exposure to contaminated areas, providing strong evidence that environmental factors were indeed causing health problems. Throughout these early days of testimony, Sarah demonstrated remarkable composure and legal skill that surprised everyone in the courtroom. Her questions were well prepared and strategically designed to build a convincing case for the plaintiffs. She showed an intuitive understanding of how to present complex evidence in ways that were accessible to jurors, and she seemed to anticipate and counter the defense's strategies effectively. Judge Harrison observed Sarah's performance carefully, ready to intervene if he believed the plaintiffs were not receiving competent representation. However, as the trial progressed, he began to recognize that Sarah's unconventional background might actually be an advantage in this particular case. Her ability to communicate with ordinary people and her genuine concern for the plaintiff's welfare were evident to everyone in the courtroom. The plaintiff community began to rally around Sarah as word spread about her courageous decision to represent them and her effective performance in court. People who had never met her before began attending the trial to show their support, filling the gallery, and creating an atmosphere of hope that had been missing since Rodriguez's hospitalization. Sarah worked late into the night each evening, preparing for the next day's testimony and reviewing case law that might be relevant to anticipated defense arguments. Emma helped by organizing documents and bringing her mother coffee during these long preparation sessions. The pressure was enormous, but Sarah felt energized by the opportunity to use her legal knowledge in service of people who desperately needed effective representation. As the trial entered its second week, Sarah grew more confident in her abilities and more determined to achieve justice for her clients. The foundation she had built during the early testimony was solid, and she was ready to present the most compelling evidence in the plaintiff's case. Internal company documents that would reveal Thompson Manufacturing's knowledge of the health risks their operations had created. The third week of trial brought the most crucial evidence in the plaintiff's case. Sarah had spent countless hours reviewing internal Thompson Manufacturing documents obtained through discovery, and she had identified several smoking gun communications that would demonstrate the company's knowledge of health risks. These documents would be the key to proving that Thompson Manufacturing had acted with deliberate disregard for public safety. The first document Sarah presented was an internal memo dated 3 years earlier, written by Thompson Manufacturing's safety director to the company's board of directors. The memo explicitly warned that chemical emissions from their processing operations could pose health risks to nearby residents and recommended immediate implementation of improved filtration systems. However, the board's response, documented in meeting minutes, was to table the recommendations pending a cost-benefit analysis. Sarah's presentation of this evidence was masterful. Rather than simply reading the documents to the jury, she created a timeline that showed how company executives had received clear warnings about health risks, but had chosen to prioritize financial considerations over public safety. She used visual aids to help jurors understand the flow of information within the company and the decision-making process that had led to continued dangerous operations. The second critical document was an email exchange between Thompson Manufacturing's chief financial officer and the plant manager, discussing ways to minimize the company's legal exposure without actually addressing the underlying safety problems. The emails referenced hiring a public relations firm to manage community concerns and exploring legal strategies for limiting liability in case health problems were eventually linked to their operations. During her examination of the Thompson Manufacturing plant manager, James Morrison, Sarah demonstrated remarkable skill in cross-examination techniques she had learned by observing hundreds of trials. She methodically walked Morrison through the company's decision-making process, using the internal documents to contradict his attempts to deny knowledge of health risks. Her questioning was precise and relentless, never allowing Morrison to evade responsibility for his role in the company's dangerous practices. Morrison initially attempted to claim that the internal warnings had been based on overly cautious assumptions and that the company had believed their operations were safe. However, Sarah produced additional documents showing that Thompson Manufacturing had conducted their own environmental testing that confirmed dangerous chemical levels in the surrounding area. These tests had been conducted secretly, and their results had never been shared with affected residents. The courtroom atmosphere was electric as Sarah revealed document after document showing the extent of Thompson Manufacturing's knowledge and deliberate indifference. Several jury members took extensive notes, and their expressions showed growing anger at the company's actions. Even Judge Harrison seemed impressed by Sarah's thorough preparation and effective presentation of complex evidence. Richard Sterling's attempts to damage Sarah's credibility became more desperate as the strength of her case became apparent. He objected frequently to her questioning and repeatedly argued that her lack of formal legal training made her incapable of properly presenting evidence. However, Judge Harrison overruled most of these objections, noting that Sarah's questions were well-founded and relevant to the case. The defense strategy shifted toward arguing that even if Thompson Manufacturing had known about potential risks, the plaintiffs could not prove that specific health problems were directly caused by chemical exposure. Sterling brought in expert witnesses who testified about the complexity of environmental health issues and the difficulty of establishing causal connections between industrial pollution and individual illnesses. Sarah's response to this strategy demonstrated her growing sophistication as a trial lawyer. Rather than becoming defensive about the scientific complexity of her case, she used it to her advantage by showing how Thompson Manufacturing had exploited this complexity to avoid taking responsibility for obvious dangers. She argued that the company's own internal documents showed they believed their operations posed health risks, making their current claims of scientific uncertainty seem dishonest and self-serving. The emotional impact of the plaintiff's testimony was devastating for the defense. Sarah called Mary Patterson, the elderly woman whose respiratory problems had allegedly been caused by chemical exposure. Mrs. Patterson described how her health had deteriorated over the past few years, forcing her to give up gardening and other activities she had enjoyed throughout her retirement. Her testimony was particularly powerful because she spoke simply and honestly about how industrial pollution had changed her life. Sarah's examination of Mrs. Patterson was gentle and respectful, allowing the elderly woman to tell her story in her own words without pressure or intimidation. She asked Mrs. Patterson to describe her life before the health problems began, creating a vivid picture of an active, independent woman who had been robbed of her golden years by corporate negligence. The contrast between Mrs. Patterson's past vitality and her current frailty was heartbreaking for everyone in the courtroom. The defense cross-examination of Mrs. Patterson was a strategic mistake that backfired spectacularly. Sterling attempted to suggest that her health problems were simply due to aging and that she was seeking financial compensation for natural deterioration. His questioning came across as bullying an elderly woman, and several jury members visibly reacted with disgust at his aggressive tactics. Sarah's redirect examination allowed Mrs. Patterson to respond to Sterling's implications with dignity and grace. She testified that she understood the difference between normal aging and the sudden onset of severe respiratory problems that had coincided with increased industrial activity at the Thompson manufacturing plant. Her quiet strength in the face of aggressive questioning won the sympathy and respect of everyone present. Young mother Jessica Rodriguez testified about her daughter's developmental delays and learning disabilities, which environmental health experts had linked to prenatal exposure to chemical contamination. Jessica described the heartbreak of watching her bright, curious child struggle with problems that could have been prevented if Thompson Manufacturing had acted responsibly. Her testimony was emotional but factual, focusing on specific ways that her daughter's condition had affected their family's daily life. Sarah's handling of Jessica's testimony demonstrated her understanding of how to present emotional evidence without overwhelming the jury's ability to focus on legal issues. She asked specific questions about medical diagnoses, treatment costs, and the long-term prognosis for Jessica's daughter. This approach helped the jury understand the real-world consequences of Thompson Manufacturing's actions while maintaining the credibility of the plaintiff's case. The defense attempted to argue that Jessica's daughter's problems could be explained by genetic factors or other environmental influences unrelated to Thompson Manufacturing's operations. However, Sarah was prepared for this strategy and presented medical evidence showing that similar developmental problems had occurred in several children from the affected neighborhood, creating a pattern that was difficult to explain by random chance. Frank Patterson testified about the financial impact of his wife's illness, including medical expenses that had exhausted their retirement savings and forced them to mortgage their home. His testimony provided concrete evidence of the economic harm caused by Thompson Manufacturing's negligence, supporting the plaintiff's claims for monetary damages. Frank's quiet dignity and obvious love for his wife made his testimony particularly compelling. During the final week of testimony, Sarah presented evidence about the broader impact of Thompson Manufacturing's operations on the entire neighborhood. Property values had declined significantly once residents became aware of chemical contamination, affecting families who had invested their life savings in homes they now could not sell. Local businesses had suffered as people avoided the area, creating economic ripple effects throughout the community. The cumulative effect of the plaintiff's evidence was overwhelming. Sarah had methodically built a case showing that Thompson Manufacturing had known about health risks, had chosen to ignore them for financial reasons, and had caused measurable harm to dozens of families. Her presentation was logical, well-organized, and emotionally compelling without being manipulative or sensationalistic. Thompson Manufacturing's defense relied heavily on technical arguments designed to create doubt about the scientific evidence linking their operations to health problems. Their expert witnesses testified about the complexity of environmental health research and the difficulty of proving causation in cases involving multiple potential sources of contamination. However, their arguments seemed weak compared to the company's own internal documents acknowledging health risks. Sarah's closing argument was the culmination of everything she had learned about effective courtroom advocacy during her years of observation and study. She began by thanking the jury for their attention and patience during the complex trial, acknowledging that the technical evidence had been challenging to understand. However, she argued that the core issues in the case were actually quite simple. Thompson Manufacturing had known their operations were dangerous, had chosen profits over people, and should be held responsible for the harm they had caused. Sarah walked through the key evidence systematically, using the company's own documents to show their knowledge and deliberate indifference. She reminded the jury of the human faces behind the statistics, describing how real families have been affected by corporate negligence. Her presentation was passionate but controlled, demonstrating genuine concern for her clients while maintaining the logical structure necessary for effective legal argument. The defense closing argument attempted to portray the case as an emotional appeal unsupported by solid scientific evidence. Sterling argued that sympathy for the plaintiffs should not override the legal requirement to prove causation with scientific certainty. He suggested that the jury's responsibility was to apply legal standards objectively, without being swayed by emotional testimony about individual hardships. However, Sarah's rebuttal closing was devastating to the defense position. She argued that Thompson Manufacturing was trying to hide behind scientific complexity after their own document had acknowledged the dangers of their operations. She pointed out that the defense was asking the jury to ignore the company's own admissions of knowledge and to accept claims of scientific uncertainty that contradicted Thompson Manufacturing's internal communications. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning with their verdict. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the foreman announced that they had found Thompson Manufacturing liable for negligence and awarded damages totaling $12.8 million to the plaintiff class. The award included compensation for medical expenses, property damage, and pain and suffering, as well as punitive damages designed to punish the company for their deliberate disregard of public safety. The courtroom erupted with cheers and tears as the plaintiffs realized they had finally achieved justice after years of struggle. Sarah was surrounded by grateful clients who thanked her for giving them hope when their situation had seemed hopeless. Frank Patterson embraced her with tears in his eyes, telling her that she had given him and his wife the chance to face their remaining years with dignity and financial security. Judge Harrison commended Sarah for her exceptional representation of the plaintiffs, noting that her performance had exceeded the standards he would have expected from experienced attorneys. He acknowledged that her unconventional background had initially concerned him, but that her dedication, preparation, and skill had proven that effective legal representation could come from unexpected sources. The legal community was stunned by the outcome of the case and Sarah's role in achieving it. News of the court clerk who had stepped forward to represent environmental victims spread quickly through legal circles, inspiring discussions about access to justice and the barriers that prevent capable people from practicing law. Several established attorneys approached Sarah about potential collaboration or mentorship opportunities. Thompson Manufacturing's attorneys immediately announced their intention to appeal the verdict, arguing that Sarah's lack of formal legal credentials had created procedural irregularities that justified overturning the judgment. However, legal experts noted that appeals based on attorney qualifications were rarely successful when the representation had been effective and the trial procedures had been fair. Sarah's victory had implications far beyond the specific case she had won. Her success demonstrated that legal knowledge and skill could be developed through dedication and study, even without traditional law school education. Her story inspired other court staff and legal professionals to reconsider assumptions about who was qualified to practice law and how legal education could be improved to better serve public needs. The financial award allowed the plaintiff families to address their medical needs and financial problems, but the broader significance of their victory was equally important. Thompson Manufacturing was forced to implement comprehensive safety improvements that would protect future residents from chemical exposure. The case also established legal precedents that would make it easier for other communities to hold polluting companies accountable for environmental damage. Sarah's life was transformed by her courtroom success, but she remained grounded in her original motivations for learning about the law. She used her newfound recognition to advocate for legal reforms that would improve access to justice for working-class families. She also began mentoring other court staff who were interested in developing their legal knowledge and skills. Emma was enormously proud of her mother's achievement and began expressing interest in pursuing her own legal career. Sarah encouraged her daughter's ambitions while emphasizing the importance of using legal knowledge to help people who needed representation but could not afford it. Their relationship had been strengthened by the experience of working together during the trial preparation. The case established Sarah as a respected figure in the local legal community, but she chose to use her platform thoughtfully rather than seeking personal fame or financial gain. She accepted speaking engagements to discuss access to justice issues and began working with law schools to develop programs that would make legal education more accessible to working people. 6 months after the trial, Sarah opened her own small law practice specializing in environmental and consumer protection cases. She hired Janet Morrison as her paralegal and focused on representing clients who could not afford traditional legal services. Her practice became known for thorough preparation, innovative strategies, and genuine concern for client welfare. Thompson Manufacturing's appeal was eventually unsuccessful, and they were required to pay the full damage award to the plaintiff families. The company also implemented the safety improvements mandated by the settlement agreement and established a community health monitoring program to ensure that future operations would not harm local residents. Sarah's story became a symbol of hope for people who believed the legal system was stacked against ordinary citizens. Her success proved that knowledge, dedication, and courage could sometimes overcome institutional barriers and achieve justice even in seemingly hopeless situations. She had shown that effective legal representation was not necessarily dependent on prestigious credentials or expensive training, but on genuine understanding of legal principles and commitment to client welfare. The courthouse where Sarah had worked as a clerk installed a small plaque recognizing her historic achievement and her commitment to justice for all citizens regardless of their economic status. Her former colleagues took pride in her success and in the positive attention it brought to their workplace. The case had demonstrated that talent and dedication could emerge from unexpected places within the legal system. Years later, legal scholars would study Sarah's case as an example of how the legal profession might evolve to better serve public needs. Her story raised important questions about traditional barriers to legal practice and inspired reforms designed to expand access to competent representation for underserved populations. She had proven that sometimes the most effective advocates were those who truly understood the struggles of the people they represented.